Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In this video, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the 151st Gilead graduation. So yes, Jehovah's Witnesses have what's called a Gilead school twice a year. It runs for 5 months, and these schools go back all the way to the 1940s, 1950s era. They were set up originally to train missionaries. Nowadays, they are used to train special full-time servants of Jehovah's Witnesses, or in other words, staff members, people who work in the Bethel or as missionaries. If you work as your full-time job for Jehovah's Witnesses, whether at one of their facilities or in the field, as, let's say, a circuit overseer or a missionary, you may be invited to one of these special classes, again held twice every year. The Gilead graduations don't tend to have as much interesting material to comment on as, let's say, a convention or a JW broadcasting episode. So quite frankly, there's not as much that I want to say on this particular Jehovah's Witness meeting. However, there are a few thoughts that came to mind when I was watching part 1. We'll see what's in store for us in parts 2 and 3, which I haven't seen as of now. But yes, I do have some thoughts for part 1. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Jesus emphasized that our neighborly love should include even enemies. In Matthew 5:44, he said, "I say to you, continue to love your enemies and to pray for those persecuting you." Our love will be perfect if we love even our enemies. Jehovah gives sunshine and rain even to wicked opposers. One publisher went to a hospital to visit an opposing husband. The man appreciated this kind gesture very much.
Isn't that interesting? So yes, Jehovah's Witnesses, according to governing body member Gerrit Lösch, speaking here at the 151st Gilead graduation, are to show love even for wicked opposers. The example that's given is of a Jehovah's Witness visiting an opposing husband when he was in hospital. And you'll have to watch the whole thing, you'll have to take my word for it, but this is all Gerrit Lösch has to say on this particular thought that he conveys of the love of Jehovah's Witnesses being perfect when it includes a love of enemies. So it was kind of unexpected to hear him say this, kind of going against the grain, well, very much so according to the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses, who are to literally shun apostates and treat them as though they don't exist. So on the one hand, they're supposed to practice shunning and disfellowshipping and disassociation towards people who no longer share the views of people like Gerrit Lösch and who speak out against the teachings. On the one hand, they're supposed to shun them, and on the other hand, they're supposed to show love. And the only example that's given is to visit them in hospital. So make of that what you will. I would suggest this is just yet another example of a garbled, confused message, which is exactly what we can expect from a human, man-made religious organization. There are always going to be examples of where the guidance and instruction is confusing and contradictory to the point where it's bewildering trying to put it into actual practice. This is the sort of thing where if you were waking up, if you were in Gerrit Lösch's shoes and it was beginning to dawn on you that it was all total nonsense, this is the sort of message you might be tempted to weave in, because yes, There's a clear verse in Matthew 5, verse 44, that literally says, continue to love your enemies and pray for those persecuting you. You know, you can't dismiss that. You can't say, well, actually, I'd rather pretend that this verse isn't there. And indeed, there are examples. If you look at the Doctored series, you'll know what I mean. There are examples of where Jehovah's Witnesses have literally changed the wording in the New World Translation to suit their narrative. But this seems to be a verse that's slipped past them. It's evaded their radar, even though, again, it goes completely against Jehovah's Witness culture. Am I saying that Gerrit Lösch is waking up or is trying to surreptitiously weave in less culty messages to his talk? I don't think so. It would take more than this to convince me. But it's indisputable that this is a narrative, this is a message that is conspicuous in Jehovah's Witness teachings only by its absence in practice. Jehovah's Witnesses are not a group that love their enemies. They are a group who weaponize family against their enemies, who use ostracism and shunning to drive them to despair.
When you talk about the ransom, don't do it just in a legalistic way by saying, see, like on scales, on one side was Adam and on the other side was Jesus. God's justice required that by giving his life, Jesus restored what Adam had lost. Rather, make the student meditate and develop heart appreciation and love for what Jesus did. Review with the student what Jesus went through prior to his execution. Help him picture in his mind how Jesus was flogged, producing quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Help the student sense how Jesus was mocked. After his tortured beating, soldiers said to him mockingly, "Good day, you king of the Jews." Also, they spit on him and slapped him in the face. Remind the student how the soldiers later pounded large nails into his hands and into his feet. With the stake swung upright, the pain was excruciating, for the weight of the body tore all the nail wounds. Yet, rather than threaten, Jesus prayed for the Roman soldiers, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Meditating on what Jesus did for us, does this not greatly deepen our love for him?
If you say so, Gerrit. It's more a case of being repulsed by the mental imagery you've just forced on us. And bear in mind, there's nothing stopping children from watching this, because this is just being put out there on the JW Broadcasting website. Goodness knows how many family worship sessions with children of Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be ruined by this mental imagery, and goodness knows how many children are going to be traumatized by mental images of quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh, which Gerrit Lösch has decided to dwell on as part of his comments in the 151st Gilead graduation. So yes, that was charming. Thank you for that. Doesn't say anything about whether the religion is true. Clearly, lots of people believe in the quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Lots of people are very passionate about the passion of the Christ. There's even a film about it that wasn't made by Jehovah's Witnesses that even shows you the quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh, if that's what you want to look at. But simply the fact that that's what's described, or simply the fact that you can conjure these mental images or spin the story out in this gruesome way, doesn't make it all true. It's still a story in a religious, sacred text for which there is no objective evidence. You just have to believe that it happened. Or specifically, in the case of Jesus, in the case of the ransom sacrifice of Jesus or the events at Golgotha, you have to believe that an intelligent, all-wise, all-knowing God would have a solution in mind for preventing millennia of human misery that would involve a man being treated in this way, that would involve essentially a human sacrifice. That's the best he's got. His solution is to arrange for a human sacrifice around 33 AD, involving his son Jesus, who he sends to earth, or if you're a Trinitarian, involving part of himself, who is sent to the earth to die, only how can he die? Because it's... Anyway, so that's the plan, apparently, to fix millennia of human misery and suffering by allowing it to continue. And at one point during this period in which there is millennia of human misery and suffering, have a person die in a gruesome way. That's the solution that an all-wise, all-knowing God has come up with. Great, okay? If that's interesting or satisfying for you, brilliant. But it doesn't prove anything, and it certainly doesn't prove Jehovah's Witness beliefs in particular to be true. And before we move on, I did just want to bring this book to your attention. You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth. This is the book that I studied, or was made to study, as a child before it was replaced in the, let me think, 1994 I think was when they brought in the knowledge book. So right up to when I was about 14 or 15, this was the book that we used to refer to, or that we used to study. It was certainly the book that I had to study leading up to my baptism. I just found it interesting, the part where Gerrit Lösch was talking about scales.
When you talk about the ransom, don't do it just in a legalistic way by saying, see, like on scales, on one side was Adam and on the other side was Jesus.
If you're familiar with the Live Forever book, you'll remember this illustration on page 63. Perhaps Tibor can overlay said image so that you can see it more clearly. It says Jesus was the equal of the perfect man, Adam. So I just found it odd that Gerrit Lösch dissuaded using this, as he puts it, legalistic description of the ransom sacrifice, when in fact it's right there in Jehovah's Witness publications. So if that way of viewing the ransom sacrifice is in fact enshrined in Jehovah's Witness literature, what are Jehovah's Witnesses supposed to do other than use that tool when they're describing why the ransom sacrifice was needed? So a little bit odd, really, just that little point. But yes, thank you, Gerrit, for that delightful recap of what happened the time that Jesus was tortured and killed.
Love endures all things. Many brothers suffered a lot during World War II and today in Russia and other countries. Today there are a number of governments in the world that suppress the truth. As we live in the time of the end, this is not surprising to us. It will get worse as the Great Tribulation comes closer. World conditions also get worse in many parts of the world, and COVID has claimed many human victims. But we witnesses keep enduring by pursuing the surpassing way of love that never fails. We shall not only live forever, but also love forever and be loved forever.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Lösch, for reminding us of how great Jehovah's love is for us.
Yes, thank you, Brother Lösch. And wasn't it interesting? Perhaps you picked up on this. Wasn't it interesting to see the contrast between the footage of Gerrit Lösch and the footage of Kenneth Cook? There's some interesting editing going on there, but basically it's obvious to me that Gerrit Lösch is speaking in front of a green screen. It's kind of obvious with the lighting, if you think about it. This is the sort of lighting that you see on the convention videos when they're speaking right in front of the camera. They don't have an audience. It's just them and the camera. And so what they've done is they've used a green screen and put the annual meeting curtains behind in, I think, the same or similar configuration to the way they are behind Kenneth Cook. And I'm not sure it's really necessary. There isn't anything weird or wrong about Gerrit Lösch giving a talk that's been recorded for the Gilead graduation. It's just weird when you try to cover it up, when you use green screen technology to make it look like Gerrit Lösch is there when he so clearly isn't. So I just thought it was worthwhile mentioning that. But Gerrit Lösch, talking here at the 151st Gilead graduation, is talking about the need to keep enduring. This is clearly something that the governing body are very anxious about. The extent to which Jehovah's Witnesses are willing to hang in there. Gerrit Lösch saying that it will be worthwhile in the end if they can come through all of the persecution that's to be expected in the time of the end, because apparently Jehovah's Witnesses can look forward to loving forever and being loved forever. Well, are you really being loved if it's conditional love? Would be my question. What does love really mean in the Jehovah's Witness context if there are strings attached, if there are expectations? In the case of the paradise, in the case of the sort of dystopian nightmare that Jehovah's Witnesses are looking forward to, we're describing a situation where you have to, for the rest of eternity, praise and worship a God who has massacred nearly 8 billion men, women, and children for the crime of not being Jehovah's Witnesses, and arranged for their remains to be somehow concealed. You have to praise that monster for the rest of eternity and spend your days convincing the constant stream of resurrected ones, everyone who's ever lived, apparently, who dies before Armageddon, is going to gradually be brought back for a second shot at things. And it's going to be your privilege to give them Bible studies. In other words, the work never stops. There isn't just going to be a point where you can just exist. You can just relax. There's always going to be something to do. There's always going to be some task for you that is devised by either God or the faithful slave or the millennial government under Christ, whatever. There's always going to be something. I can't look forward to it, and I certainly wouldn't describe it as genuine love when you are supporting and facilitating a regime responsible for what would be the greatest act of genocide ever known.
They were speechless when they heard she would leave home and join full-time service. Instead of pursuing their common goals, dreams, and hopes, she would do whatever she was told to do. What a sacrifice. They were so proud of her. And they started thinking about what to do in order to support her. Whom are we talking about? Let us open to Judges 11. And let's find out who they were and what they did. Dear soon-to-be graduates, what they did is something that will help you to succeed in your assignment. Let's read, please, Judges 11, verse 40. From year to year, the young women of Israel would go to give commendation to the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. The young women of Israel went to the sanctuary in Shiloh in order to give commendation and praise to the daughter of Jephthah. Commendation strengthened this full-time servant of Jehovah. Is this not what you want to do too? So that's why we have the question for you. How often will you go to Shiloh? Will you strengthen others and stabilize the organization by regularly commending and praising others?
We're watching governing body helper Gaius Glockentin speaking at the 151st Gilead graduation. And it's interesting that he's speaking here about strengthening and stabilizing the organization.
Will you strengthen others and stabilize the organization by regularly commending and praising others?
That's indeed the whole purpose of Gilead. Gilead is all about making sure the organization is strengthened and stabilized. In other words, do we have enough people in various branches, in various parts of the Jehovah's Witness hierarchical network, who know what's expected, who know what the procedure is, who know how the governing body like to do things? Let's make sure they're being trained, and let's make sure that everywhere around the world where there are Jehovah's Witnesses, everyone's on the same page and everyone's doing things by the book. That's essentially what's meant by strengthening and stabilizing. That's why Gaius Glockentin is talking here about the daughter of Jephthah. But it's interesting that what he's essentially doing is doubling down on a total rewriting of that verse in Judges. And if you've been watching my series Doctored, you'll know what I'm talking about. Here is a thumbnail, if Tibor is gracious, of part 1 of that series. It turns out there are dozens of examples in the New World Translation of the authors taking a Bible verse, not liking what it says, either because it conflicts with Jehovah's Witness teachings or because it makes the Bible sound bad, and just changing the wording. And what Gaius Glockentin is using for the whole basis of his talk is one of these examples in Judges chapter 11. Let's remember the story, or let's recap. And apologies if this is a repetition for those of you who've already seen me talking about this, again in the Doctored series and elsewhere. If you read from verse 30, it says, "Then Jephthah made a vow to Jehovah and said, 'If you give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites will become Jehovah's, and I will offer that one up as a burnt offering.' I'm gonna burn them. Whoever comes out of the door to greet me first gets offered as a sacrifice. What could possibly go wrong?" So then, further on down, we learn that Jephthah's daughter comes out. And in verse 35, it says, "When he saw her, he ripped his garments and said, 'Oh no, my daughter, you have broken my heart. For you have become the one I have banished. Now I have opened my mouth to Jehovah, and I am unable to turn back.'" Think about what's said there. You have broken my heart. Well, in the context of him having to kill his daughter by burning her, that would sort of make sense. It wouldn't really make sense if he was just sending her off to be a nun, which is the Jehovah's Witness spin on this. Because if what's happening here is that Jephthah's daughter ends up becoming a full-time servant, as Gaius puts it, why would that be heartbreaking? Surely that's something that Jephthah would be delighted about. He'd be thrilled. Oh, brilliant. My daughter gets to be a nun, gets to Work full time for Jehovah. That's fantastic. Why would he be brokenhearted? It only makes sense if he's thinking about what he's promised he will do. And then in verse 36, it says, "But she said to him, 'My father, if you have opened your mouth to Jehovah, do to me as you have promised. Since Jehovah has executed vengeance for you upon your enemies, the Ammonites.' She then said to her father, 'Let this be done for me. Let me be alone for 2 months, and let me go away into the mountains, and let me weep over my virginity with my female companions.'" Again, this makes total sense in the context that we find it in the Bible. She wants to weep over her virginity for 2 months because she's about to be killed. She's about to be offered as a human sacrifice. If you're a Jehovah's Witness or a Bible apologist, you could say, yes, but elsewhere in the Bible, God condemns people who make their sons or daughters pass through the fire, who offer their children up as sacrifices. So that can't be what it's talking about. No, I'm sorry. That's not an answer. Because what you're doing is you're saying that it's impossible that the Bible can contradict itself, which, I'm sorry, I'm not buying. It's perfectly conceivable that a man-made book would contradict itself. So then you get to verse 40, which is the basis for Gaius's talk. And in the New World Translation, it says, "From year to year, the young women of Israel would go to give commendation to the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year." Good job, daughter of Jephthah, who's... We're not going to say your name, by the way, in this whole Bible passage. We're going to refer to Jephthah, your father, by name, but you're kind of just a daughter. You don't get to be called by anything. But even though you're not worthy of a name, we're going to commend you. We're going to give you commendation every year. Good for you, Jephthah's daughter. Good job with the nun thing that you're doing. Keep that going for the rest of your life. That's apparently what happened. Just one small problem, as I point out in the Doctored series, when you look at all the other Bible verses, that's not what's being described. So maybe we can do things as we do them in Doctored, and maybe Tibor can show you what it says on BibleHub.com, where we have multiple renderings of the same verse in different versions of the Bible. New International Version, that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Commemorate? New Living Translation, for young Israelite women to go away for 4 days each year to lament the fate of Jephthah's daughter. Okay. Commemorate, lament the fate of. Starting to sound a little bit more like something bad happened to Jephthah's daughter. English Standard Version, that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. Similar in Berean Study Bible, that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. King James Bible, that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year. You don't lament someone when you're giving them commendation, do you? Lament is something that you do when something terrible has happened, something tragic even, and you are memorializing this terrible tragedy. That's what's described in every other Bible version, but in the New World Translation, they change it to commendation. Good job, Jephthah's daughter. You did this thing that was completely out of your control because it had been decided for you by the patriarch of your family. So yeah, it's just fascinating to see Gaius Glockentin doubling down on this, and you'll have to watch the whole thing. I'm going to spare you the rest of the talk, but he keeps referring again and again to this, and he keeps spinning this false narrative that is completely made up by Jehovah's Witnesses to square this circle of the Bible describing something barbaric. He keeps repeating this false narrative as the entire basis for his talk, namely that the Gilead graduates are to be strengthening and stabilizing for the organization, and one way they are to do that is by commending people at every opportunity, as happened in the case of Jephthah's daughter. Only again, when you look at all the other versions of the Bible and you examine that verse, you see it tells an entirely different story.
Please turn to Matthew chapter 6 and note verse 3. Matthew 6, verse 3. But you, when making gifts of mercy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Now, what did Jesus mean? Well, these gifts of mercy were really donations for needy ones. But with these words, Jesus was exhorting his disciples not to imitate the insincere religious leaders of his day, who publicized their gifts of mercy just to be recognized by humans. Now, what would be the result of heeding Jesus' words here in verse 3? Well, Jesus explains in verse 4. He says, so that your gifts of mercy may be in secret. Now, for a moment, think of the gifts of mercy, the kindnesses, the theocratic assignments that you have performed in secret. For example, likely you've many times telephoned, visited an ailing brother or sister just to reassure them of your love, your concern, and even pray with them. Or perhaps you spent considerable time being a spiritual mentor to a Christian youth. Or you may have given generously of yourself to encourage and provide practical assistance to a distressed brother or sister. All of this you did in secret.
We're watching US Branch Committee member Luther Georges speaking at the 151st Gilead graduation. And this is the second time in this particular event where a Bible verse has been wheeled out that bears no relation to the reality of what the Jehovah's Witness organization is all about. We've already heard in the same event Gerrit Lösch, governing body member, citing Matthew 5, verse 44, continue to love your enemies and pray for those persecuting you. Jehovah's Witnesses, as I've already said, are not an organization that loves their enemies. They're an organization that very much punishes and persecutes, particularly those former members who leave the organization and speak out against its various abuses. Now we have another verse that talks about the need to carry out your gifts of mercy in secret, to not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. He even specifies the fact that this applied to the Jewish religious leaders and the fact that they would publicize the things that they would do to help people. Am I going crazy? Or is that not exactly what Jehovah's Witnesses do in their many, many videos that have been produced in recent years, showing them rendering aid, showing them turning up to a disaster place, giving out food boxes, fixing the homes of fellow believers, responding to these emergencies, to these catastrophes around the world? I mean, if making a literal HD video about something and publishing it for millions of people to see isn't publicizing your gifts of mercy, I don't know what is. So this was a hard one to wrap my head around. it's yet another example, again, the second in this event, of where the words of Jehovah's Witnesses and the actions of Jehovah's Witnesses can be two different things.
One other thing that's noteworthy about these women is that these women were not easily thrown off by others. Remember, we talked about others, the other disciples. When other disciples left Christ, the women stayed. At Golgotha, even the apostles, to a certain degree, had left Christ or fled. The women stayed. They stood solidly on their own faith. Brothers and sisters, do not be thrown off easily by others. Sometimes, you can imagine for these women with the disciples, it felt like a family. And sometimes today in families, ones choose to leave Jehovah. Even at this late hour, stand solidly on your own faith. Like the women, do not be easily thrown off. Stay with Jehovah.
We're watching Trent Lippold, who is a Gilead instructor, speaking at the 151st Gilead graduation. You can see why I've singled out these comments. It fits in very well, doesn't it, with the entire narrative of Jehovah's Witnesses just putting their hands over their ears and saying la 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 whenever they are confronted with evidence that debunks their beliefs. And in this particular instance, he's saying, don't be easily distracted or thrown off from your faith. I guess my question would be, what do we mean by easily, I'm not aware, out of all of the people I've met who have become ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, who have left the organization, I don't think I'm aware of a single one, particularly those who were in the organization for years or decades, where it was easy, where they were easily thrown off their faith by what others said to them or what others showed them, or by the information that they encountered. In my own case, it was excruciating, I titled my book The Reluctant Apostate for a reason. There are so many reasons and so many hang-ups and so many fears keeping you locked inside this organization that when you do start to question things, when you give yourself permission to learn more, to do objective research, and the entire matrix, the entire web of illusion starts to crumble, it's a terrifying experience. No one is like, oh, this is fun. let's do this. This is easy. It's a very, very difficult thing. And for Trent Lippold here to be talking about it in terms of, being easily thrown off by what others have to say, he clearly doesn't understand how this works. Or if you think about it, he's suggesting that those who have left are flaky, are the sort of people who are fickle and just easily led along. They're gullible. Why would you want to follow after former members who couldn't stick it out? They didn't have the fiber. They didn't have the integrity and the endurance to go the course, to stick around until the end. That's the sort of psychology I think is being deployed here, and it's a psychology that works, quite frankly. Jehovah's Witnesses watching this will be thinking, yeah, even if I may have doubts, even if there are certain things that don't make sense to me, I'm going to stick it out to the bitter end, because where else can I go? That's the mentality he's appealing to. It's a culty mentality. It's a thought-stopping mentality. And it keeps millions of Jehovah's Witnesses captive to a belief system even long after it has stopped making sense to them. Anyway, that's all I have for you. That's it for part 1 of my rebuttal to the 151st Gilead graduation. I haven't yet seen parts 2 and 3. I can imagine there will be at least something of interest. So there will be at least a part 2, maybe a part 3 review or rebuttal. Look out for that in the weeks ahead. But that's all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching.